The following content is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition.
Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Marina Spriggs, and I'm the host of Always Another Way podcast. I have a master's in professional counseling. I'm the Edgar Award winning author of Stop Looking for a Husband, Find the Love of Your Life, and Nasty Divorce, A Kid's Eye View. I have been writing positive divorce advice for the HuffPost since 2012, and I'm trained in clinical hypnosis. And this podcast speaks to out-of-the-box thinkers, and it's for those who hear the call of hope and always another way. And if you're extremely rigid and set in your beliefs, and this probably isn't your cup of tea, however, you should note, taste can and do change. And I just want to thank you again for listening, and also my encouragement to please go to your podcast app, subscribe to Always Another Way podcast, rate it 5 stars. It will push it up to the top so more people can hear all of the wonderful interviews and guests and learn about ways to do things another way. And we have a really, a very serious and exciting and important show today. It's a very serious topic that is extremely underreported in the news. Statistics say, and this is from a most recent article, that every 98 seconds, someone in the U.S. is sexually assaulted. And every 8 minutes, that victim is a child. Meanwhile, only 6 out of every 1,000 perpetrators will end up in prison. But you know, these statistics are way off. I know this for a fact because I've never reported it. I know more than 20 people that have never reported it. I'm a therapist, have clients come into my office that have never reported it. So it's actually way worse, and it's way worse in other countries. So just know that, if you can just see that on a grand scale. And then recently, a new grand jury report says that internal documents from 6 Catholic dioceses in Pennsylvania, that's just one state, okay, show that more than 300 predator priests have been credibly accused of sexually abusing more than 1,000 child victims. And that's just what's reported. And I'm just going to throw some other stats around to you about the number of people that commit suicide on the daily in this country, the rampant drug and alcohol abuse we have, problems and violence. And if you don't think that all of these things are not related somehow, well, they are. So we are going to talk about all of this and a riveting book called Dark Chapter by my guest, Winnie Li. Winnie is a writer, producer, and activist. She was selected as a George Mitchell Scholar and earned her MA in English at the National University in Ireland, Cork. As head of development at Ugly Duckling Films, she was involved in producing 6 award-winning films and 2 shorts, one of which was Oscar-nominated and the other Oscar shortlisted. She received her PhD at the London School of Economics on rape survivors and social media. A Harvard graduate from New Jersey, she is now based in London. And I just want to welcome Winnie to the show.
Hi.
Hey, wow, Winnie, what a book. I mean, just really, really so. I was sent a copy of Dark Chapter, and I'm a voracious reader myself, and knew what the subject matter was and what she was going to talk about it. But in reading it, I mean, really just such a gripping, well-written novel well-developed characters, and we're going to talk about the book and then the kind of parallels with it. But I just want to just say it's a really good book. I mean, well done, and an Edgar Award winning finalist too.
So, I mean, it was a lot of work to write, so it's always nice to hear.
Yes.
They say it was good.
Yeah, it was really good. I read a lot of books, and it was very well done. I mean, very well done. Kept you reading. I mean, just the interest and just everything that happens. And so let's kind of dive into that. So you have your own experience, and then this one of the main character in Dark Chapter, and they're similar. And then we'll kind of like sort of lump this into one question that you can sort of long form answer, how that happened and how art and creativity kind of helped you cope with this process.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, it's a long and ongoing process, right? And in some ways, it's something where I actually, obviously, had never anticipated something like this would happen to me. So, I mean, in brief, about 10 years ago, I was walking through a park in Belfast on my own. So I love hiking, and the outdoors has always been a really important part of my life. I never really thought much about hiking on my own as a woman, because at the end of the day, I'm there to kind of appreciate nature. But I suppose on this particular hike, I was followed by a stranger, and that stranger kept on following me, and eventually violently assaulted and raped me. So that was something I obviously didn't see coming that day when I stepped out on that hike, and it was something that changed the course of my life, the way it would for pretty much any survivor, any victim of that kind of assault. So I was immediately just faced with the fact that, like, oh, damn, this thing I didn't expect coming has just happened, and I was in complete shock for months, probably years, I can count all the many different ways in which my whole life was changed, but at the end of the day, it was a sense of a complete rupture in my life, and I thought my life was going this way. I was as a film producer at the time, I wanted to produce a particular film. I thought my life was going to be really cool, and then I suddenly felt like I wasn't able to function, because the PTSD, the anxiety, the depression were that bad. So it was really shocking, and it was something that I think I'm still recovering from, and I think somebody will always be spending their entire life recovering from that kind of trauma. But at the same time, I've always been a writer, so I think from the age of 6, I'd always wanted to write books anyway, and writing was always my way of coming to terms with the things that happen in our lives and coming to terms with them, trying to make sense of the world. So pretty early on, I'd say even just a few weeks after the assault, I just realized that I kind of had to write in some ways about this. I mean, there's no way I could live through something this life-changing and this horrific and not try to write about it. But from there is actually a different process from, just using the writing to recover. There's a difference between that and then deciding to write the book, which was Dark Chapter, because writing a book, which is going to get published, hopefully, which other people are going to read, it's a very different way of kind of taking something which is incredibly painful and personal and somehow transforming that into maybe something that's a bit more accessible, that serves a purpose, and that can sort of help to connect people in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And so with that, and I know how when something just awful just happens and just takes you just completely derailed, and how long it really takes to get back with all those things. And then, at what point and kind of during that of the, because for a lot of survivors, and Winnie can attest to this, healing is not like you broke your arm and you go to the doctor, you set it, you get a little cast for 6 weeks, and then, hey, we're all good. It is, it's psychological after that. The trauma that goes in, that sets in, that lives in places that can come out in all sorts of insidious ways. And then I'm just wondering, as you're doing this and using this art, how did you kind of make that differentiation when you were writing the book? Was it hard to do, or did you feel like more of a purpose, like I'm going to get through this? Or how was that in writing, and kind of maybe not the same story, but in similar-esque feelings and events?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually kind of both. It was something where, of course, it was hard to do. I mean, writing any novel is hard to do. Obviously, writing a novel inspired by your own real-life rape is harder in a lot of ways. But there was very much a sense of purpose for me. So I'll get to that in a bit. I mean, just going back to what you said about recovery, I mean, you're right. It is very different from breaking an arm and having that guilt, because that's pretty much a straightforward kind of sense of recovery, right? And recovering from a trauma like this, yeah, over time you do heal, but there are so many kinds of, one day you might feel like you're a little bit better, or the next day you're back down in the dumps, and that there isn't any straightforward process. And, for a long period of time, for years, I actually thought I never was going to recover from that. I mean, in some ways I am still always recovering, but I definitely felt like, my life had been changed drastically. I had really bad agoraphobia. I couldn't leave the apartment. I went from being a really adventurous, outgoing person to suddenly like not being able to set foot outside of my apartment. My job was really important to me at the time, and I just wasn't able to work because of the PTSD. So I was unemployed for 2 years, and that was really hard at the time when I was 29. And all my friends there who hadn't gone through something like that, their careers were thriving. They were getting married. I was going to weddings, and I was feeling like a complete outsider and just feeling like my life was never going to get back on track. So it was really hard. It was really hard thinking that was never going to happen. And then gradually, time does heal these things. And yeah, I just basically decided that I was going to have to write because writing is the way I always deal with these things. But when I was going to write the novel, I was going to have to recover first from the initial trauma before I could be in a position to write it as fiction. So it was about 5.5 years before I started writing a novel, even though I came up with the idea for it pretty early on. And for me, the important part of the idea was that it wasn't just going to be a story about a woman who had been through this kind of trauma, who'd been raped, and who was going to recover from that. It was also going to be intertwined with with the perpetrator's storyline. Because for me, I can't really make sense of that kind of life-changing event if I'm not looking at the person who's causing that trauma. And I can talk about my own recovery and my own journey all the way, but I wouldn't be going on that journey in the first place if it weren't for that person who had raped me. So I felt, as much as I didn't want to think about the perpetrator, it was necessary to have to intertwine those two storylines in a way that maybe raises issues about, what is the cause of this kind of behavior? What drives a stranger to do that to another person? The shocking thing about my particular rape was that my perpetrator was a 15-year-old boy. So he was very young. I actually had met him earlier on the hike, and it didn't occur to me he was going to be dangerous because he was so young. So that kind of violence exists in the world, right? I'm a victim of that kind of violence. So I kind of felt, for me, not just as an individual, but also as a writer and as a kind of, I suppose, a thinker, the only way I could make sense of that was by trying to look at his life and trying to imagine what his life had been like that had led him to being so violent at such a young age. So I basically had to, but I was like, okay, well, first things first, I got to recover, right? So it was a very slow process. I had to go through the whole legal process. He pleaded guilty in the end. I then had to go through a very long process of thinking, like, am I ever going to get employment again? And so fast forward 5.5 years, I was in a different place in my life. I had a job again that was paying well. And I could have gone on and, carried on with that kind of career. But I just realized, like, what, I want to go back and I want to write that book, which I've been thinking about for the past 5 years. And writing the book was also in some ways a validation of me as a writer, because again, I'd always wanted to be a novelist from a very young age. So I was like, well, I can actually take my writing skills and my, interest in storytelling and sort of apply that to this awful thing that's happened to me, and in the process create a book. So there's something actually quite validating and reaffirming about being able to use, my own creative process to, in some ways, gain control over, what was a situation which meant I didn't have any control, sexual assaults, and also to recraft it and reshape it into something that was maybe more meaningful and more productive in some ways.
I love that, and let's kind of talk more about that, and then and maybe we can go into a little bit about as you're getting healed, and and as this is kind of moving on. But the role in, and even you said, and just a lot of people, like, nobody expects, obviously, this stuff to happen. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So it's multifaceted. And, at least from the character in the book, trauma begets trauma. So there is, I don't like to use, always and nevers, but I highly doubt there is someone with a very, very safe, secure, and loving upbringing that goes out and perpetrates rape on people. I don't imagine, with nothing happening to that person, that happens. And in my graduate studies in counseling. So we talk about people that are child molesters, and they'd ask this little seg, is there any population you won't work with? And of course I'm like, yeah, not those people, you know, because at the time I was actively still, and I didn't have specific trauma therapy, like, no. And then what you learn is that every single person has also been sexually abused. So it is that of, but then when you're in that, you know, and you see like the damages that it just did to you and to everybody else, that just knocks you off of life for a while and derails a pattern that you then have to learn how to live a new normal. And with all those lives change, but I like the inspiration actually of you coming out and using those things. And so let's talk about that, because I know there are a lot of people that have never disclosed sexual assault that might be listening, maybe people that have gone through things that you have, but to learn and to hear from others that there is healing, there is survival, there is another way of life that's just as fulfilling. And let's talk more about that, about your TED Talks and your activism and how this has spurred you into a new level, maybe that you didn't expect before.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you had told me in the year after my assault that I would be doing Skype interviews with complete strangers, right? Or doing a TED Talk in front of 2,000 people, or, you know, I've done pretty much 80 public speaking events since my book came out a year ago. If you told me I'd be doing all that, I would say, like, there's no way. I mean, I never would have believed you, because I was so kind of temporarily destroyed by what happened. Like I said, I couldn't even step out of my apartment, and speaking to strangers, just having a conversation with a stranger would freak me out. So I never believed I was going to recover from that kind of trauma. So if you told me then that, like, 10 years from now, I mean, you're going to be doing all this, right? I wouldn't have believed you, right? So, I mean, I think that is largely, you know, that speaks to the potential for recovery that we all have. Yeah, I mean, there's things there's aspects of my life that have been more affected, you know, like, you know, my finances or whatever, or dating or romance, like that's, you know, more affected than my ability to, you know, speak to strangers and all that. But so, you know, and for everyone, it's a different form of recovery. But yeah, I like pretty much thought that was impossible. And then gradually I did get better. And along in the way of recovering, I told a lot of my friends what had happened. The thing that it'll come out in the book, but when somebody reads it, but when anybody reads it, it'll come out in the book that my rape was really widely reported in the news at the time in Northern Ireland. So there was something very strange about having, you know, complete strangers, like, you know, reporters writing about my rape, you know. And so the headlines all said, like, Chinese tourist violently assaulted in the park by a teenager. And I just remember thinking, actually, like 2 days after my assault, I was Googling around, because I'm still a curious person, right? And I Googled my rape, and I came across all these headlines, and that was kind of really quite surreal. And then I also came across like a radio kind of a chat show, kind of like the most popular radio chat show in Northern Ireland, and they were talking about my rape, which was very, very weird to hear. And there was a woman who called in, so they were having people call in and comment on, like, does this mean Belfast is still a safe city? And this woman called in and she said, well, my heart goes out to that wee Chinese girl, it's me, wee Chinese girl, because her life is now ruined. And, like, I know she was coming from a place of sympathy by saying that, but I just remember hearing that and thinking, like, well, that's really weird that she's saying that, because she doesn't know me. And also, like, I thought that was maybe a dangerous thing to say. I mean, you know, for me to have just heard from a complete stranger this pronouncement that my life was now ruined because of something another person did to me, I thought it was also quite dangerous that other people might be listening to that who also themselves are victims, and that would reinforce the idea that the life was now ruined. So, you know, it was just a strange thing to be confronted with so soon after the trauma. And I think that kind of speaks to the way that this trauma replicates itself for a victim. It's not just the violence and the PTSD and all the psychological issues that come with that. Issues, I hate that term, but all the psychological impact. But it's also just the way that we're judged by society, and the way that we're perceived by society as being, you know, ruined or complete victims who are incapable of leading our lives that we'd like them in the way we'd like them to be. And that was what I felt for a long time, but I was able to recover. People that are helpless, you know, there's that ubiquitous image of, you know, the woman sitting in the corner, you know, with her face in her hands, or, you know, or the woman with the profile that you don't quite see, which is always the image when you hear about news reports of rape, right? So there's this notion notion of like, we don't even want to be associated with what happened to us, and we're so ashamed, and our lives are ruined. And that's like the ubiquitous image that's changing obviously in the past year. But that's really different from me. It's really different from a lot of other survivors I know. And, some of the most resilient people I know are survivors of sexual violence. So I just kind of felt like it was actually important to change the narrative. So instead of the weak, of us always seeing weak and vulnerable victims whose lives are ruined, we actually see people who have the ability to recover, who do recover, who are able to reshape their lives in more meaningful, maybe more authentic ways. So that kind of led to all the activism I do. Also, like along the way, when I was telling my friends about what happened to me, because it was all over the news in Northern Ireland, I felt, okay, I can't really hide this from my friends because that would just be a little bit disingenuous. So anybody that I was close to, I did tell them, listen, I was assaulted and raped in a park in Northern Ireland on that trip, and like my life's not really the same as it is right now. So, and that's partly because I had changed so dramatically in the course of like an afternoon. I felt like I couldn't hide that. And the more I told my friends, the more all the female friends, all my women friends started telling me about their rape, or if it wasn't their rape, the time that their aunt or their mother or their sister or friend had been raped. So I just started to realize that it's actually a very, very prevalent thing, which we never talk about. And then having just lived through it and having just gone to all the lengths that I had to go to try to deal with the impact of it, I'm like, this is ridiculous. There's so many lives being impacted by this crime, and yet we're not talking about it. We're not being very honest society. We're not being honest to ourselves. We're not getting the kind of support and the treatment that we need and the understanding we need from the rest of society. So all the activist work I do is largely about that, changing the narrative, but also really centering and empowering the voice of the survivor. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones that have the lived experience, and that we're the ones that have the knowledge and the experience that can maybe start to educate our society a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can talk a bit more about that, but I'd love to feel like I'm rambling. So like, I'd love to hear you talk, and then I can riff off of that. So.
Oh no, that was good. And so like, let's just like keep going there with the more people that talk about it, because it is one. And then I'm, can't speak for you, but I feel you feel the shame, you feel dirty, you feel, and then segging a little bit into the conversation in the book, the Vivian, the main character. So she ends up after the rape, with a boyfriend. And then he says something to her like, well, it's because you've been raped that you're this way, essentially, like, can't deal with that and the emotional baggage that comes with. And I've heard that before. Other people I know have heard a similar sentiment. And let's talk about why it is, because there are so many people, and just like other crimes, that go on, this is the only one where the victim is really made to feel guilty, bad, and shamed by society, by everyone else. And then, of course, the accusatory victim-blaming stuff. What were you wearing? What were you doing? Oh, my gosh, you were a woman hiking alone by yourself. And just stuff that, to go back to, not, and I don't like that woman said ruined either, but it messes with you for a while. And to open up that conversation with people that this is what it's going to do. But I do think, and at least for me, knowing that I wasn't the only person, knowing that there's more people, and that we can talk about it and then really let that go. And over, I don't think it could be said enough that it is not your fault. No part of anybody's fault of a victim of sexual assault.
Yeah, because I mean, the very definition of sexual assault is that it didn't have your consent, it wasn't there, right? I mean, so if you didn't consent to it, I mean, literally for me, I was walking in a park and somebody followed me and did that to me. That's quite clear cut. The people that are always challenging this argument are going to say, oh, but there's gray areas when like a man and a woman go out on a date and she's flirting with him. And I said, and yeah, but that's still not consent. If you're flirting with somebody, if you're smiling with them, if you kiss them, that doesn't mean you necessarily want to have intercourse with them. And that, so you can't really say that there's these gray areas. Just why we say that there's gray areas, or society says that because we don't want to think that so many other people are committing rape. Yeah. But in reality, rape falls into all sorts of different forms and guises, I suppose. I mean, mine was stranger major rape, and that's the kind that gets reported the most in the news. But, 9 out of 10 victims, at least in the UK, 9 out of 10 victims are assaulted by somebody they actually know. So we need to actually start calling that rape and realizing that that also has just as bad impacts on the victim's life. But the shame, you're right. It's like, where does the shame come from, right? Obviously there's all sorts of religions that say, like, a woman should be ashamed if this happened to her. But as a feminist, I'd say that those are like kind of patriarchal religions. But, it's also, lots of rational people who aren't specifically religious also feel ashamed about having been raped. And I think it's just something that, like, society has kind of pretty much embedded in us. And the sad thing is that because of the sense of shame, so many people don't share their stories, and then you feel even more isolated, and it's even harder to kind of get access to the resources you need to recover.
Yeah, and so, gosh, and then the people, and then of like that you said of like that everybody's got that stranger danger rape, but then when it's a priest, a dad, an uncle, a brother. And then women can be perpetrators of this too. It is a extremely smaller number, but not to discount that. And a lot of men too are victims of sexual assault. And they tend to keep even quieter than women do. Yeah. Because then they get well, aren't you a strong dude? You can't fight that off, which is another misnomer that a lot of people have said. And like, well, I would have just kicked his ass. But yeah. You think that until you hear the woman that's a 5-degree black belt that was gang raped that did not kick any ass, because that's not what it's about. So,
and the thing is, you have no idea how you're going to react in that situation, right? I had done some self-defense training, but like when you're in that situation, like, your body reacts in all different sorts of ways. So some people freeze, and that's actually a really good survival technique, right? And yet later on they feel guilty that they froze because they didn't fight back. And some people fight back, and I tried to fight back, but I actually realized I was going to be even more injured if I tried to do that, because this person was incredibly violent. So at the end of the day, like for me, and I think for most victims, it just feels like that is the safest, in any bizarre way. I know that sounds weird, but that's the way that you don't die, is by allowing that thing to happen. But you don't obviously really allow it to happen. But even me afterwards, even though it's a pretty kind of clear-cut scenario, I was like, how did I let that happen to me, right? And it's also tough if you're I think in this day and age, and I mentioned this in my TED talk, we like to think we're told that our life is the result of the choices we make and how hard we work and how smart we are and all these sorts of things. And are we looking after ourselves? And there's so much burden on us as an individual to be responsible for our life. But then sometimes things happen to you that you have no control over. Right. And you still feel like, oh no, I was somehow guilty, or I played a part in that thing happening to me. And yet at the same time, but that's not the case. The case is just that sometimes bad things happen to people, and instead of putting the blame on yourself, we actually need to be looking more widely at the whole issue and realizing that there are perpetrators that are doing this, and creating a system where perpetrators are actually being held accountable for it. Yeah. So, yeah.
And then talking in exactly like that, those natural reactions, and in a split moment, your brain's not thinking about anything but surviving, and your body chooses which way to go, not you. That's how it goes. Yeah. Body chooses in that. And so let's talk just a little bit more. And I just saw that you're maybe writing another book too.
Yes, I am. I started writing it literally the day after my TED Talk. So the TED Talk was like the last TEDx talk, actually. That was like the last thing I did for my book tour. I had like basically a 13-month book tour for Dark Chapter, which was a bit crazy. But then obviously I'm quite driven as an activist in wanting to create these sorts of conversations around what's a very important issue. So I ended up planning like 13 months of events and like going to all different countries and talking about it. And it was fascinating, but also exhausting. Finished with the TEDx talk, and like the next day I started writing the next book. Partly because I sort of wanted to be able to start creating something new. I can't talk too much about it because it's pretty early days, but it is feminist, it is contemporary. It's quite topical, and it does explore issues not so much about sexual violence, but about the kinds of gender inequalities that exist, and and how that's still important, how that still affects us, as women, and it affects the kinds of careers we want to have. I can't talk anymore about that, but I'm enjoying writing it.
Well, we'll talk to you when it's done.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what else do you want the audience listening to know kind of about your experience, your healing, and what it also means to, it's extremely is a lot of work to work through what is usually like an event, one isolated event, change the course of your life, all this work done. And just you're such an inspiration of just hope and renewal. That what would you tell people listening? Something they can do, or a conversation we want to open up? Anything else you want people to know?
Well, I mean, like you said, you're not alone. So, and I wish somebody had told me that actually when I was really dealing with the worst of it. I mean, I think maybe instinctively I knew, but I don't know. It's so hard to describe for me. I mean, obviously I wrote a book about it, so I guess I have described it. But for me, I kind of felt like I was kind of plunged into this like kind of sort of icy bath, and I was like underneath for a really, really long time. And it was so long before I was able to rise to the surface. So when I was underneath, I couldn't really see things well. I was in this like kind of self-enclosed bubble of misery in some ways. And, I had suicide ideation. I was incredibly depressed. And I wish somebody had said, even though other women were sharing their stories of what happened to them, they had kind of recovered. I got in a sense that they had recovered. So, and I was kind of completely on my own in terms of having to deal with this pain. And so, like you said, you're not alone, and there are other people out there, and especially with the internet, you can find kind of support groups online for survivors, and then survivors of child sexual abuse, survivors of, date rape, it can get quite specialized in terms of the support you want to find online. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, to tell somebody, because it is really hard to keep that to yourself. But the caveat is sometimes you tell somebody and that person doesn't actually react in a very supportive way. And that's a problem because our society isn't well educated enough to know how to react to these things. So I've heard so many stories from other survivors who tell me, the first time they told, their parents blamed them and said, oh, you shouldn't have been drinking so much that night. Or they would tell, if they were in university when it happened, they would tell a friend, and their friend would say, well, you sure that really happened? Like, maybe we're imagining it, or like, he's a nice guy, he wouldn't do that. So there's all these, unfortunately, people aren't great necessarily at reacting, and they sometimes say these things that are really, really hurtful without understanding the impact that it has on the victim. So it is quite dangerous, and I can understand how completely scary it is to tell your story and to tell your truth to another person, because you don't know how that person is going to react. But if there is a bad reaction, the thing to bear in mind is that doesn't mean that what happened to you wasn't true. It doesn't mean that you were responsible or guilty or played a role in that happening. It just means that the person reacting isn't the most educated on this issue, and themselves hasn't really thought enough about it. And it's a sad thing that our society is like that sometimes, but I'm hoping that that conversation will change, and it'll only change if we start having more conversations. So it is important to kind of I think share the experience with somebody that you think you can trust, and to just realize that if that person doesn't react well out there, there's like a load of other people out there who believe you and who can provide the support that you need.
Oh, that is such great advice, because that is the truth, and just can recount people telling me that they told their parents a story and it was, what did you do? And then just that letdown, especially from parental figures or people that you trust, but just such a good message that just, keep talking, find trauma-specific help, help for trauma in more healing. And so where can everybody find you? So definitely go get Dark Chapter. It is a riveting. It is an excellently written book. It'll give you a glimpse into the life of what happens to somebody who has been raped, and how a life can go on one way and then be suddenly changed. But then Winnie's personal story offers hope, because, I believe there's always another way. But let's tell everybody where they can find you, hear about you, see what's coming next.
Sure. So Dark Chapter you can get pretty much you can get it online, and you can get it in most major booksellers. I don't know if it's physically going to be in that many bookstores, right? But you never know. So you can get it through Amazon, you can get it through Waterstones in the UK, or Barnes & Noble in the US, and most independent booksellers can order it for you. And it's out in a number of different languages, so it'll eventually be out in, I think, 11. Well, it'll be out in English plus 9 other languages around the world. So yeah, So have a look for Dark Chapter. It's coming out in Germany, and actually the title in German is Nein, N-E-I-N, which means no. So, but yeah, I mean, if you look up Dark Chapter, you'll be able to find it online. There's also an audiobook, and it's out in ebook as well. And then my website is Winnie M Li, WINNIEMLI.com, which I update with all the different events I'm doing. So I'm going to start doing a few more public speaking events. My TEDx talk is there as well. I'm on Twitter at Winnie M Li, and my Instagram is also Winnie M Li. And I also run a festival called the Clear Lines Festival, which is in the UK, and we're looking at expanding it to the US as well. And that's kind of a festival that uses the arts and discussion to address sexual assault and consent. Because, I mean, it's not, okay, I've written a book, and there's loads of other people who've also written books, but there's incredible, like, theater being written about these issues, some really good films, lots of documentary films and narrative films. So we'll do film screenings and have conversations about it. There's spoken words. There's some really good comedy that makes fun of rape culture out there. So I just kind of, in 2015, I created kind of this festival, which happens at the moment in London, but we're looking at doing events elsewhere, which creates a space for this art to be kind of seen and performed, and for people to come see it and to engage in these conversations. So so clearlines.org.uk is the website, and then I'm winniemli.com, and the book's called Dark Chapter.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Winnie. And I'm really sorry that this had to happen to you, to do all this too. But you are just an inspiration and a survivor. I love that you're keeping the conversation going in different mediums. Have so much just great advice for everyone. And hopefully the Clear Lines can bring its way to the US. Because the more people that talk about this, the more that you can know that there is always another way. Just because something has happened to you like this does not define you. It is not you. It is not your last chapter, but maybe just a dark chapter. I'll use your book title there.
And there is brighter chapters ahead.
Always brighter chapters ahead. That is the truth, because there always is another way. You are not stuck. Thank you so much, Winnie, for being on the show. I really appreciate your candidness and all of the wonderful information you've given.
Thanks so much, Marina. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. And there is always another way.